of all, for those of you who I think everybody here knows me, but I'll just introduce myself. My name is Scott Spitzer. I'm Rabbi Tilchin's spouse, and I'm also a board member of the Jewish Collaborative, um, one of the founding board members. And for those of you who don't know what the Jewish Collaborative is all about, it's a nonprofit organization um, dedicated to helping people, Jewish people in all walks of life, connect to and see the vibrancy of their own Jewish practice and their own Jewish identity in a whole range of different things, including tikkun olam, social justice, learning, right? Like this program, Advanced Learning Institute, um, a weekly Mariv Minyan online for those who are interested and need to say Kaddish or just want to daven, traditional davening. Um, a bereavement group that we have going that is really important. Um, so all of these are designed, they sound like a lot of different things, but they're all focused on two things: collaborating with other organizations and helping people who are Jewish in different ways to find meaning in their Judaism in their current lives. So that's the whole goal. It's a big, broad goal, but you guys who know, everybody here knows Rabbi Marcia knows she's up to the task. Uh, so Advanced Learning Institute, you guys are very familiar with Rabbi Daniel Levine. Um, those of you who have studied here before, and those of you who are friends of Daniel who are here today. But let me just say a couple brief words before I turn the mic over to Daniel, which is that uh, so most of you have studied some text with him and know that oh, and Madalena, you should feel free to put this on Facebook right now. Um, so no, most of you know Daniel from studying text, but and I'm sure all of you know that he's also the rabbi for the Orange County Hillel. The Orange County Hillel, which is and Tammy is the director, the executive director for Orange County Hillel, and she's with us today as well. Um, so Orange County Hillel has three campuses. It has University of California, Irvine, Chapman University, and Cal State Fullerton, where I'm a faculty member. And Daniel serves all three of them. So that's a very big deal, especially since October 7th, which is, of course, the topic of today, but even well before that. And there's been, you know, challenges and excitement about, you know, all of the different things that our students at universities have around being Jewish and finding a way through their, you know, to connect with their Jewish identity. And Daniel's been a huge part of that. I have come to know Daniel through my work with Hillel and also through the Jewish Collaborative. Um, and through my son, Avi Spitzer Tilchin, who was a member of Hillel at Cal State Fullerton, where he went to college, and Avi had the experience that many of our students have, Jewish students have had. He had a personal relationship with Rabbi Daniel that was instrumental in his personal and religious and spiritual and professional development. Uh, Felt he could go to Daniel and talk to him about the most personal things, big questions about Judaism, personal questions about relationships, all of that. And I know that was incredibly, and it is still incredibly important to Avi, that relationship. And I know that countless other students feel that way, which is in a great testimony to his expertise and his importance in our community. So you knew about his brilliance as a teacher and as an intellect, but I wanted to tell you about that as a rabbi. And one other thing I'll say, I think of, you know, sort of the old, you know, stories about the rabbis in the Talmud and how they were itinerant and they would go from community to community and teach here and teach there, and they would get a reputation as being a great teacher, and people would come from miles around whenever they would come to the community. I think Daniel's kind of like the modern version of that, because he's teaching he taught classes at UCI, he's taught series of lectures at Cal State Fullerton and I know at Chapman and at Long Beach where Avi took a class with him there. So Daniel's in the community speaking and teaching all the time to all different kinds of groups. And we are so lucky to have him today. So I'm going to turn it over to him to talk about this incredibly powerful and difficult subject of ongoing anti-Semitism on our college campuses. So Daniel, Rabbi Daniel.
Yeah, Scott, if I ever have to interview for another job in my life, I'm going to bring you with me. That was such a nice introduction. Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. I'll give one forewarning. I got a new puppy, and so if you hear some barks in the background, that is her. That is not me being annoyed by any of the questions that anybody here has. I want to start with a little bit of an overview, and I figured this is probably going to be a little bit more conversational / question and answer than a lot of, I am very much a nerd in the time, I love nothing more than to throw up, a dense Talmudic text and spend 40 minutes parsing it. But the topic today is a little bit even more complicated, so to speak, than a dense Talmudic text. So just to give a broad overview, it's funny because 8 years ago when I was in grad school, I actually decided to write my master's thesis on the history of Jewish communities on college campuses. I specifically wrote a lot about Hillel, which is one of the big reasons why, I was inspired to work for the organization. Hillel was founded 101 years ago. I mean, we just celebrated the centennial, and it was formed in this really chaotic period of American Jewish life. And I want to paint the historical picture just to give a little bit of a road to how we got here. And then, of course, I'll talk about October 7th and post-October 7th, what was happening. Hillel was founded, depending on who you ask, right, 1923, 1924, right? The brainchild probably existed a couple years before. This was a really pivotal time in American Jewish life. Just to give a reminder, this was right after World War I. There was chaos for the Jewish community in Europe. In 1924 is when America signed its most, whatever we want to call it, its most harsh immigration act of. Before that, certainly my great-grandparents, I'm sure if we took a poll here, half of you at least have one grandparent or parent or somebody who came to America between 1881 and between 1924. And this was, of course, the major wave of Eastern European immigrants, right? There was a series of pogroms in Russia. And this is when 2 million people came overseas, right? They came to Ellis Island, right? The story that we've seen in movies and plays and, the end of Fiddler on the Roof and everything there. And then 1923, 1924, after World War I, there was a huge uptick in anti-Semitism in America. And you can look at, either cartoons that were there talking about how the Jews are the ones that are, forcing the border open and taking people's jobs. Again, you can see a similarity to a lot of, current political attitude, right, in certain spheres, right, the America First attitude. There were Jews who were unable to get into America. There's a lot of prominent historians that actually connect this to before 1924, most American Jews, they might have had neutral views on Zionism, but it would be very rare if you were to drop into a synagogue in America in 1910 and you were to ask the congregants, are you a Zionist? You probably would have had a bunch of no's, a bunch of I don't knows, and a bunch of I haven't really thought about it much. And it's this time in the 1920s which really formed what we know to be American Jewish life today, right? If we're going to study one decade, it should be the 1920s. And this is exactly when Hillel opened in 1923. There's some different good myths, right? All good Jewish origin stories need the mythology behind it. So when I was researching for my thesis paper, my favorite story, I have not been able to fact check this anywhere else, but this was in a op-ed sometime in the 1930s in a newspaper in America, that apparently a Protestant Bible teacher at the University of Chicago was upset that he was talking to Jewish students in his Bible class and Jewish students didn't know basic stories of the Torah. And he went to, whatever the local synagogue was and went in and said, how can we have a bunch of young Jews in college and they've never heard of, Jacob and Esav, right? How can this be? And he actually helped launch some of the seed money and some of the organization for Hillel. Is that true? I have no idea, but it's a fascinating story just talking about, right, the building blocks of campus organization. And the 1920s also were a very difficult time for Jews on campus. There's a whole series actually I think it was Tablet, but I'm not sure. They did a whole series on Jews in the Ivy Leagues. And they talk about how from Columbia to Harvard to Brown, all of these schools were figuring out policies starting in the 1920s to actually reduce the number of Jews that were able to enroll. And so one just interesting case study is Columbia. Columbia actually opened up a second branch that was, many blocks away. That was their sort of quote unquote overflow campus. But when they looked into it and saw the, statistics of it, they realized that's where they were sending all the Jews. And the, upstanding, the real college kids, right? And this is a theme that'll come out more and more again, right? The good students who represent, what a Columbia student should look like, which of course in the mid 1920s was a, waspy, Protestant, white, almost always man. So the Jews went to the, city college down the street, and, Columbia basically had this policy until I believe the 1950s or 1960s. But over and over again, right, campus has always in some way been a fascinating microcosm of the American Jewish community. And one of the things that I always like to say about campus is campus takes every issue that's happening in our wider society and just multiplies it by 10 in terms of the intensity. And this can be both for good and for bad, right? Plenty of incredible movements have come out of campus. Plenty of terrible movements have come out of campus, right? You have a bunch of 18 to 25-year-olds that, of course, you all know how college works, but for the first time in their life, they're not living at home. They're living in this mini city that is set up just for them. They have all their food taken care of. They have their housing taken care of, right? All the things that I have to worry about on a daily basis. What am I going to eat for breakfast after this call, right? If you're a student, right, you don't have to worry about that. You just show up and somebody puts a plate of food in front of you in the dorms, and, you show up, you get to learn all day from, interesting and provocative and deep thinking professors. And so, of course, that's going to breed a lot of intensity and intense thinking, either for good and for bad. So that's very much, campus in terms of a microcosm. Just to paint the story and fast forward a little bit, because I think, I'm going to guess people are more interested in the last year than they are in the 1920s. But just one more brief, just historic interlude. It was a big deal in the post-Holocaust era, right? The 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. Jews in some way had succeeded in turning anti-Semitism into something that's anti-American. And this was a really big deal for American Jews. And, as much as there's, a debate and there's a like and there's a dislike, if I were to say the term Judeo-Christian values, in 2024, some of us might feel uncomfortable with this idea because perhaps it speaks to a certain social conservatism, right? Not worth getting into that debate now. That phrase was championed by liberal Jews in the 1950s and 1960s, not because of, LGBT policy or abortion policy, but because that was really the first time in history that any leadership in the Christian world said Judeo-Christian and not Christian, and they should probably convert, right? So this was a big deal, right? Jews were really making it as in some broader way, equals and an equal part of this American experiment. And this, of course, coincides with from some broader perspective of American history. And as Scott said, I actually just taught a course on American Jewish history this year. So this is a perfect timing. I'm all caught up on, I've read about 7 academic books about American Jewish history in the last couple of months. The success of liberalism really started to pervade this country in the 60s and 70s. And again, there's a lot to discuss about, what it means to be a capital L liberal, whether or not it's always good. Are there some pitfalls? But America really started moving in this direction of we're going to treat everybody as individuals, not as a part of a group, right? I am not Daniel the Jew. Whereas if you drop into any point in Jewish history, right, it doesn't matter if it's Yemen or Iran or Russia or Spain or France, anytime between the year 0 and the year 1900, if I dropped into any other country in the world, I was the Jew who's, it happens to be that my name is Daniel, right? But I was treated first as a Jew, right? Is that bad? Is that really bad? Is that neutral, right? It depends on where you are in the historic context, but there was not this idea of individual liberty that I am valuable because I am Daniel the individual. I was part of this broader community. The success of liberalism in America really tried to bring about this idea, right? We saw this in feminist movements. We saw this in Martin Luther King Jr., right? Over and over again, liberalism broadly was, I would argue, a sweeping success in America overall, right? Obviously not without its pitfalls, but it was also incredible for Jews because here we were for all of history, virtually for the last 2,000 years, especially in the diaspora, right? I'm not talking about Israel now. In the diaspora, Jews were always treated as a class of people. All of a sudden, once that status was reduced, and it was Tammy, the individual, who could engage with Jewish identity or could not, and Daniel, the individual who could engage with Jewish identity or could not, that was incredibly good for Jews. And Jews really bought into liberalism in a major way, right? This is a lot of what accounts for, just the overwhelming numbers by statistics of Jews that are in the mainstream liberal institutions. And again, I'm not saying liberal as in not conservative, but capital L liberal, right? Things like media, things like politics, because Jews threw themselves behind this idea. So we get to today because even before October 7th, and this is something that, people have been noting for the last really two decades, liberalism in broad strokes has been under attack really by both sides, right? I don't think you can have a thoughtful conversation here without noting that, there's a dangerous squeezing from both sides of the extreme. I will say, before I say this, my views do not represent, anyone, either Hillel or Jewish Collaborative or anything. This is just, Daniel, the individual speaking, right? It's obvious from the right, on broader societal trends of what's happening with the idea of liberalism, right? We have a president who still has not conceded the last election. He's talking about America first and separating, the real Americans from the non-real Americans, right? That's never gone well for Jews. And we've seen over the last couple of years, really mostly outside of campus, right? This hasn't really made it onto campus in the same way, but we've seen increased anti-Semitism from the right. Of course, Charlottesville, of course, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, the Poway shooting, right? These are all part of this really proliferation of right-wing anti-Semitism in the form of illiberalism. And then on the far left, of course, we've seen a lot of movements that are trying to go back and select for this identity-first worldview, which, fine, it might be reasonable in a lot of cases, right? I don't think that's ipso facto bad, but it had the effect that Jews were back to being a group, and a group that the far left doesn't really know what to do with, which just gets me to the second part. There's three quick parts, and then I'll take any and all questions. People don't know what to do with Jews, right? People do not understand who Jews are. People don't understand what Judaism is. People don't understand where Israel and Zionism fits into that. And this is a very complicated issue. This is something that our Jewish students are confused about, our Jewish students that grow up going to synagogue, going to summer camp, going to youth programs. There's probably not a day that goes by at Hillel that I don't have at least one student come to me and ask me some clarifying question about Jewish identity, right? Am I still Jewish if I don't know if I believe in God? Is my cousin still Jewish because we found out that her mom, X, Y, and Z, right? All these very complex questions that, again, we can nerd out, studying from a historical perspective. But Judaism is very confusing, right? I don't need to tell people, in this collaborative that, right? You've all been studying Judaism for many, many years, right? The reason why we keep coming back to study is because we understand how confusing this is and how much it needs more study, right? I once joked, I was talking to a good Christian, a good friend who's a Christian a couple of years ago, and he asked me, if Jews have Bible study. And I thought for a moment then, I really badly wanted to just, say yes. Of course we have Torah study and, whatever. But, I was feeling in a funny mood. And so I said, what do you do at Bible study? And he says, oh, I don't know. The leader of the Bible study goes through verse by verse and everybody listens, and maybe, every once in a while somebody will ask a clarifying question. And I said, no, Jews don't really do that. We open the Torah and then, immediately just a debate ensues. And, the person leading it, if they're doing a good job, they bring in 3 different opinions from the last 2,000 years that all disagree with each other. And he said, oh, that's strange. I was like, yeah, that is a little bit strange, but it is part of Jewish tradition. And so when it comes to who Jews are as a group from the far left's point of view, Jews are often considered part of the mainstream majority, right? Jews are considered white. Jews are considered, white Americans who happen to be of the religious persuasion of a religion called Judaism. And again, we can debate the academic merits of that, right? That's probably mostly false, but again, somebody could levy an argument there. But what that ends up resulting in terms of just practical effect for Jews on campus is that Jews are not viewed as a group on campus that's in need of protection, which seems bewildering when one understands the history of anti-Semitism and the legacy. But the reality is, for most, and again, I don't want to say all, but for the majority of diversity initiatives, from the majority of equity, inclusion, right, offices, right? I'm not talking about any campuses in specific, but just from talking to, hundreds of Hillel colleagues across the country, Jews have a very hard time convincing specifically academic and by extension left-wing institutions that Jews are a minority, one, and that minority status is in need of protection, and three, that Zionism in some way fits into that. Now, this is not to say that it has never been my personal view that anti-Zionism is ipso facto anti-Semitism. I've always rejected that. People are always shocked when I say that, but we have to allow for a distinction. Just two examples that nobody ever likes my examples, but that's never stopped me before, right? There is a huge section of the ultra-Orthodox community that is non-Zionist, right? Satmar is probably the most famous. We oftentimes think of Chabad as the biggest Hasidic community, but Chabad's actually second. Satmar is the biggest Hasidic community in the world, so they're a little bit bigger than Chabad. This is the population of, depending on whose count you trust, 700 to 800,000 Jews that are deeply engrossed in Jewish identity, and for theological reasons, they are not Zionists. And we have to allow for a definition of Jewish identity that accounts for that. We can think they're wrong, right? I think they're wrong, right? I would theologically and philosophically debate a Satmar rabbi. Satmar is very insular, so it would probably be very rare for us to ever confront a Satmar rabbi. And if one is, engaging with us, they're probably out of the mainstream in their community. So it's a little bit of a paradox there. And on the other side, we have to account for the legacy of, again, going back to the 1920s, there were a lot of very thoughtful pieces and thinkers in the Jewish world that thought that Zionism was a bad idea, right? They weren't demonizing it, right? And this is where I'm going to make the distinction in a second, right? But Jewish thinkers that were saying, hey, Zionism might not be the protection for Jews and the panacea for political protection that, Herzl and his ilk think. Perhaps Jews should stay in the diaspora and make sure the diaspora becomes more liberal and more progressive. And perhaps Zionism might actually make things worse, right? It'll make Jews more of a target. It'll single out Jews more, right? If anti-Semitism, right, just to understand the logic, again, we can also disagree with this on philosophic grounds, but just to understand their logic for a second, if one accepts the premise that anti-Semitism is formed by Jews being seen as the other, then perhaps Jews should stay in the rest of the world, convince the rest of the world that we are not other, that we are the same. And in some ways, Zionism is the movement that's saying Jews are other, right? We need our own state. We need political protection. Look at our unique history. Now, again, I hope I don't need to clarify that I personally am a Zionist, so I reject that view, but it's a reasonable view, right? We can have a conversation with somebody that has that view. I've met students that have that view, and I would never suggest that them or the Satmar rabbi, sitting in a town in New York City, right? I would never suggest that they are anti-Semitic. But what obviously becomes anti-Semitic is when Israel is demonized in the same way, right? Either through phrasing or the tropes, or just in the same style that Jews have been demonized over the last 2,000 years. And this is a very important issue to be able to describe. This is probably the second most common conversation I have with students, right? If Jewish identity is every day, this is almost every day of what, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, right? So we have to allow for a form of anti-Zionism that is not ipso facto anti-Semitism. Of course, that allows for criticism of Israel, right? I'm never shy in my views, right? I think, again, personally, I'm very critical of the government, right? I wrote many op-eds and recorded many podcasts about what Bibi has been doing for years in terms of the internal structure of the government, right? I'm not a fan of settlements, right? So none of that makes me, any closer to an anti-Semite than if I were to say, I think Bibi is the best prime minister in Israel's history, right? Those are political viewpoints. But when there's a full-scale attack on Jewish identity and Jewish history, right, that ceases to be, oh, we're just talking politics, right? That all of a sudden becomes anti-Semitism, right? Just to give one example, right? I've been thinking a lot about these examples. I've had many times, of course, to think about this over the last couple of weeks. I don't think anybody here would say that it is racist to criticize the policies of Barack Obama, right? If we were to say that Barack Obama's, I'll give a very banal example, right? If I were to say, right, and I'm making this up, I don't actually know what his tax policy was, but if I were to say Barack Obama's tax policy was terrible, I don't think anybody would say you only believe that because you're racist. But if you adopt the conspiracy theory that Obama was not actually born in America and that he had a forged birth certificate, that's racist, right? This is the same thing with when it comes to Zionism in Israel, right? If you tell me that, I don't like policy A or policy B, and I think this is actually bad for the Jews in some way, you can come up with as harsh of an argument as you want against Israeli policy, Israeli action, even the idea of Israel. That's different than full-blown conspiratorial thinking of the history and how it got there in the first place. So just as an example, one could say, right, and I have these conversations, right, these are the important conversations we need to be having with our students. One could say, in 1948, there were Zionist militias that did things that we would consider immoral, full stop, right? I won't even explain the sentence, right? Now, maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, right? We're having a historic debate, right? There's nothing wrong with historic debate, right? We can read, Benny Morris on this issue, right? We can see, the academics still debating this issue. If I were to say the actions caused by Zionist militias in 1948 that were immoral were caused by a fundamental doctrine of white supremacy rooted in colonialism, that's anti-Semitic, because that is attributing a conspiracy where there's no conspiracy there. And so it's become more important to be able to dissect these views, because what's happening on campus right now, and what I'm seeing firsthand, is any and all attacks on Israel, calling Israel, Nazi-like, saying Israel's colonialist, saying that Jews actually have no historic connection to the land of Israel, saying that Ashkenazi Jews are really just white and Israel's white supremacists, right? Any and all of these statements and these framings, right? The idea that Israel is interested in killing as many babies in Gaza as it wants, right? Now, again, I'll just give one more example and then I'll pause for some questions. One could say that the way that Israel is conducting the war in Gaza is not correct and maybe even unjust, right? Again, it's a debate. We can have, military scholars come, we could compare statistics, and we can have that real difficult conversation that I've been having with students for the last, 8 months. And one can say, okay, how does this compare to, America and Iraq and Afghanistan? Is that even a good benchmark? What is a good benchmark? What's the proper, how do we deal with this tension between rooting out Hamas and collateral damage? Has Israel sided too far on the rooting out Hamas and not paid attention to collateral damage? Maybe, right? Let's have that conversation. That's different than adopting, again, a conspiratorial view of saying Israel's sole goal is to kill as many innocent Gazans as it can, because that simply is not rooted in any reality. And so what's been happening on campus and why our Jewish students are so frustrated is those two things have become conflated. And every time Jewish students, and again, I'm still speaking broadly and nationally here, anytime Jewish students complain or they say, hey, my professor is saying X, Y, and Z, or my TA is saying X, Y, and Z, or, the sports team that I'm a part of, their official Instagram account just tweeted out this. And somebody looks at it and says, oh, this is problematic, right? It's problematic to say that Ashkenazi Jews are European colonizers that are interested in, rooting out brown people, right? This is based on a true story. And they say, hey, this might be anti-Semitism. Their response is, no, we're talking about Israel, right? We're not talking about Judaism. And that's a problem. And so campuses are really at this tension right now where I hope, right? I hope they're able to figure something out, because this is really the direction that a lot of administrations across the country are getting to. Now, I will say just optimistically, and then I'll take, any and all questions. Optimistically, this has been, to quote famous literature, right? It's the best of times and the worst of times, right? It's obvious how it's the worst of times in some way for campus, Jewish students on campus, but it's also the best of times. I mean, we've seen a doubling of attendance across all Jewish communities in the country. I mean, I'm in touch with other Hillels, I'm in touch with other Chabads. I mean, everybody has seen their numbers double throughout this year. I mean, the number of students we were getting to either, a Parsha and pizza or a Shabbat dinner, or students interested in taking Jewish studies classes, skyrocketed compared to, any of my other 6 years working for Hillel. And leadership has really been born out of this, right? For the last, 10 years, it was so common whenever I talked to, post college age Jews, there was often this fear of, well, the Jewish students now are too, feeble, and they're too scared, and, they're very fragile and delicate. And so I don't know if they can be, we have a leadership crisis, right? That's the exact opposite of the truth, right? The students in some way are what's keeping, I think, myself, I know, I'll only say this publicly because I know he said it publicly, right? The head of the Center for Jewish Studies at UCI has talked a lot, publicly about how Hillel and the Jewish, the Hillel students have, really helped him keep his sanity this year, right? I know it's the same across other campuses. And so the leadership that's been born out of this is incredible. And our students really are ready to take on this challenge. And that's a credit, I think, to other Jewish institutions, right? The collaborative synagogues, Robin Steinmetz's student to student, right? Hillel, of course, right? All these institutions that are centered around doing this, they really have worked. And so on the one hand, we have a problem because the wider campus culture and both the far right and the far left are sort of squeezing us in the middle. And, we're becoming increasingly, in the fetal position. But on the other hand, the next generation is really ready to strike back really on both of those sides. And it's really been incredible to be able to see it in a way that, I've honestly had more times being inspired this year than really any other years. So I know that was very general. I'm happy to answer any and all specific questions or anything like that. But yeah, I will cede the floor to any questioners. Yeah, go for it, Rhea.
So what occurred to me is the town Jews, that I hear a lot of what's becoming of our Jewish students at the universities. They don't know anything about Judaism. They don't, blah, 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 of informing us about the uptick of knowledge that the Jewish students have, and what a difficult situation for them to be able to articulate their new knowledge, or be able to, it's in a formation, from what you're saying, it's in a formative stage of developing Jewish consciousness and knowledge within the Jewish students. And so I think we need information about this, because there's a lot of criticism about sending your kids to college.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I'll say a couple things. I mean, and I put myself also in this category of, older Jews, right? And I'll explain why I'm doing that in a second, right? College is fundamentally different right now than when I was in college. I mean, I think I might have been, one of the last years of college of, I was very involved in the Jewish community in undergrad. I was even a part of, Israel Dialogues, and I co-wrote an article for the, Daily Bruin at UCLA with the president of the Muslim Student Union about Israeli-Palestinian, conflict and how we can have mutual dialogue. And it was intense, right? Campus every once in a while, something happened that we thought was a huge deal, right? There was a BDS thing going to be voted in. This is, 1% of what I've seen this year. I mean, it's not even possible to compare it in terms of what I and, anybody in college in the last 30 years has gone through compared to what these students are seeing. And rather than back down, again, throughout, we've had two different reactions, right? It's not a given that anti-Semitism is going to lead to more Jewish interaction, right? In my medieval Jewish history class or philosophy class, the period of medieval Jewish philosophy ends during the Spanish, Inquisition, right? So starting in 1391 with a series of pogroms in northern Spain, and then through 1492 with the expulsion of Jews, the Inquisition starting, after that, 2/3 of the Jewish community in Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, converted to Christianity during the Inquisition. Now, again, I have no judgment for them because their lives and their property and everything was on the line. But there have been times in history where anti-Semitism has caused a lot of Jews to leave Judaism, right? It's again, by no guarantees. But rather than that happen, again, there's obviously, because someone's going to ask me about this, so I'll just preempt the question. Yes, there is a growing but still small vocal minority of Jews across campuses in the country that have become very prominently anti-Zionist, right? That is certainly there. Certainly, if you compare Jews that are in their 70s to Jews that are in their, teenage and 20s, you're going to have, 5 times as many anti-Zionists in the, Jews in their 20s, but 5 times that is only, 8 or 9%, right? And again, this is through polling data, this is through, anecdotes, this is through talking with other Hillels throughout the country. And this is even more of a reason why I think our Jewish students that have stayed within the mainstream have actually had to study, right? 30 years ago, it was mostly taken for granted that being a liberal Zionist was the right view to have in America, right? I was reading older op-eds, from the 90s because I was curious, right? This was a time in which if you were a liberal American, you were supposed to say, I hope for a 2-state solution. I think Oslo is a good idea, right? I'm hoping for peace, right? And then everybody, right? Obviously, you had your hardliners, anti-Israel. You had the Soviet Union pushing, very virulent anti-Semitic anti-Zionism. You had, your hardliners on the right who said, Oslo's terrible and what, Rabin is doing is throwing the country to the sharks, right? You had those views, but if you're in the middle and you're in the mainstream, you don't really have to think too critically about, well, why am I pro 2-state solution, right? It sounds good, right? If you explain the situation to somebody with no prior knowledge and you explain it for 5 minutes, the question they're probably going to ask you is, why don't they just share it or split it in some way? But now that's not the case anymore. Now the view that you're supposed to have in a lot of settings on campus is saying Zionism is terrible. It needs to be abolished. It's rooted in colonialism. And, forget 2-state solution from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And so to counter that, you actually need to know something, right? You need to know which river and which sea and what Zionism is and what does colonialism actually mean and what's the history of Zionism and where does, the Torah fit into this and what about the Tanakh and, the Talmud and, well, if Zionism is just a modern phenomenon, why did, Judah Halevi and, Nachmanides in the 12th and 13th century, leave Spain and travel to the land of Israel, right? Like these are things now that our students are engaged with because they're a lot more important in some way than they were 30 years ago. So yeah, I think it is really important, really for everyone to know this because again, the Jewish engagement is changing in a way that I think the Jewish community, is becoming more aware of in the sense of, I don't know a lot of 19-year-olds that go to synagogue consistently. Given that people are getting married later and having children later, if at all, again, I'm not, a prophet, I'd be hard pressed to argue that number is going to radically change. But that doesn't mean that they're not interested in Jewish life. And that doesn't mean they're not passionate and they're not knowledgeable. And so there really is, I think, this cognitive dissonance when I talk to students and then when I talk to, older Jews like myself, but, even my friends. I mean, I'm 30. I talk to my friends that haven't been engaged with college campuses in years, and they even will say, oh, well, all the college students now are just, either too scared to say anything or all anti-Israel. And I tell them, I'm like, listen, I don't know where you're getting that from. I mean, I'm engaged with, as Scott said, 4 campuses, the 4 closest campuses to where we're all sitting, assuming you're in Orange County. And I'm connected to Hillel rabbis and professionals across every campus throughout the country. And so I would really, not that you're saying that, Rhea, but I would really push back against that. And then, Robin, I see that you have a question. I'm trying to skim it right now.
Asher also has a question.
Oh, Asher, go for it. And then I'll read Robin's while you're...
Okay. How do you reconcile or inform all of us that Zionism's legitimacy comes from the Holocaust in great measure? It's not necessarily from the Torah. And that was the change, the event that was a dynamic of Zionism. And now it is the language of the Holocaust that is being used to accuse Zionism of being genocidal, and it's challenging.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. I'll say two things because there's two different sides. One, I think we have to actually push back against the idea that Zionism is because of the Holocaust. And I think for students, I mean, students have that intuition a lot. If it wasn't for the Holocaust, there still would have been a Jewish state. It might have taken a couple extra years, and it might not have had the overwhelming international support initially. But Zionism, I mean, you know, whether we started with Herzl in the 1890s, with Chobabet Zion in the 1870s, or even, you know, with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, or even this post-World War I, right? It was after World War I that galvanized American Jews to Zionism, right? You know, the updated, the Columbus platform of the Reform movement, right? That was, you know, really before the Holocaust. In a lot of ways, that was an answering to the closing doors of America. I mean, that's what really convinced most American Jews to be Zionists, right? When the doors of America were open and there wasn't such bad anti-Semitism yet, right? You know, America was considered the Golden Medina in Eastern Europe, right? People literally, I actually just interviewed a Holocaust survivor for my podcast last week, and she talked about growing up in Poland as a young girl. You know, she's in her late 80s now. And she said after the war, she was, you know, 12 or 13 or something. And she said, well, I knew I had to get to America. And I said, why? And she said, well, we all thought that in America, money grew on trees. And so this was an idea, right? They quite literally, I mean, maybe not literally, but the idea in, you know, Yiddish newspapers in Eastern Europe was you come to America, you get rich, and then you also lose your religious identity, right? That was also their, you know, part of it. But, right, that was the idea. And so when America's doors were open, it was harder, right? Not impossible, but it was harder to convince American Jews of the need for political Zionism because things were great in America between the Civil War and World War I. What happened during World War I is again, we all know, right? That's also when the ADL was founded in response to the Leo Frank lynching, right? This is also, I'm forgetting the exact year, this is also early 1900s, right? This is when things start to change and real anti-Semitism comes to America in a way that it just wasn't really present in the early 1800s in any major way. And so that's a long way of saying, I think Israel still would have been founded if it wasn't for the Holocaust. The Holocaust obviously was sort of the last, you know, the last punch of if anybody was not convinced by Herzl, I think before the Holocaust, I hope the Holocaust convinced them that Herzl was right. Just a reminder, Herzl's view was essentially Jews need to have their own political autonomy and their own military because even the most progressive of societies could end up very quickly becoming, you know, hellholes for Jews. That was exactly true about Germany. Germany in the 1920s was probably one of the more progressive places to be in the world. And then, you know, we all know what happened. People co-opting the language of the Holocaust, I mean, that's anti-Semitism. I mean, if somebody says what's happening right now in Gaza is a Holocaust, they are spreading anti-Semitism. I mean, I'll say that, you know, very clear, right? They know what they're doing, first of all. And so they aren't being, you know, oh, I thought this was just a vocab word that meant, you know, right. This is specifically meant, I think, to take the knife and twist it into the, you know, the soul of the Jewish community. And I think we have to push back against people saying that, and also call it out. I mean, you know, I went and looked, you know, when the Assad regime, you know, a couple of years ago was butchering Syrians by the tens of thousands, you know, far more people were hurt or displaced than is happening now. No prominent, you know, intellectuals on the far left were calling this a Holocaust, right? I've seen Jewish studies professors, you know, that have posted, what's happening right now in Gaza is a Holocaust. I didn't see them say the same for the Assad regime or anything else. I mean, this is anti-Semitism. And so there, I do think, right? And again, that's different. Just going back to our statuses before, that's different than somebody saying, I don't think the war that Israel is conducting in Gaza is fully just. Fine, that's a political view. Let's discuss. I'll get coffee with you. I have my views, you have your views. But right so yeah, I'll try. I hope that answers the question. Sorry for the long-winded response.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions or anything? Oh yeah, go for it, Professor Spitzer.
Hi, it's Debbie. I have a question. I know they keep saying it's colonialism. How come no one, and maybe you could, I'm not exactly sure what what it truly means, but no one ever brings up close to the 1 million Jews that were kicked out of all the Arab countries at the same time. And, they think, so that's my question or my comment.
Yeah, I mean, again, there is an erasure of non-Ashkenazi Jewish identity that's also happening here. And we, and I'll say we as in me included, everybody in this call, it's interesting. I have sort of one foot in the Ashkenazi community and one foot in the Sephardic or Mizrahi community. My wife is Persian, and so her entire family and most of my friends from college are in the Persian community. The Ashkenazi community does a very bad job at also remembering that they are as much of a part of the Jewish. I mean, even to the extent that I do it. I mean, if somebody asks me what a traditional Jewish breakfast is, I'll say a bagel and lox. It's not wrong, but that's a traditional Ashkenazi Jewish breakfast, and a traditional Shabbat dinner is not matzo ball soup and chicken. That's a traditional Ashkenazi Shabbat dinner. Ghormeh sabzi in the Persian community, by the way, it's much better than matzo ball soup. That's an aside, but that's a traditional Persian, Shabbat dinner. So I think that really runs everywhere. I mean, students just have no idea. When two of my best friends growing up were Yemenite. And I tell students about that, even Jewish students, but all, mostly non-Jewish students, and they're shocked. They have no clue that there are Yemenite Jews. I mean, I don't know how, because Jewish history is, quite literally, between Israel and Babylonia, which was, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Egypt. I mean, these were the main Jewish communities of antiquity and also the Talmudic age. And then North Africa were some of the main Jewish communities of the medieval age. So I think it's a failure of us being able to explain history. But yeah, it really complicates the narrative. So I think that nobody who's highly, highly critical of Zionism really brings that up, because I think that's too much of a, again, I usually am more charitable to counter arguments. I think that that's a confounding variable that just doesn't fit nicely with this idea that Zionism is a European and white movement. The only time I hear this addressed is for people to say, well, the Jews that were living, let's pick our favorite country, the Jews who were living in Iran or in Yemen or Syria, they actually had great lives in the 1800s and early 1900s. And then because of the Zionist movement, they were kicked out. And so this is also a fault of Zionism, right? I've heard that before. I mean, that's ahistorical. I mean, you can read, there's some great scholarship done on what life was like for Jews in the Arab world. It, of course, was not as bad as Jews in the Christian world, right? Again, if the genie pops out of the bottle and says, 1300s France or 1300s Yemen, take Yemen every time. But it still wasn't great, right? If they say, 21st century America or 13th century Yemen, right? No one's ever taken the 13th century Yemen, right? Or 18th century Yemen. So I think we have to do a better job at understanding that, because again, this is also a problem that's happening in Jewish studies departments across the country. Just to harp on that for a second, this rise of ahistorical narratives of Jewish history, saying that life was this, panacea for Jews, for non-Ashkenazi Jews living in the Islamic world, pre-Zionism. And it just, there's a letter, just to root this in something, more historical. Maimonides, the Rambam, famous medieval philosopher, lived in Spain, then lived in Morocco, then lived in Egypt, right? So he was very familiar with the Islamic world. He actually had to flee from Spain because of the Almohad. They were a more radical Islamist group that forcibly converted Jews to Islam. So he fled to Morocco and then, to Fez, and then he ended up in Cairo. he has a letter that he sent to the Jewish community of Yemen. And again, this is not a, secondary academic source. This is Maimonides' firsthand letter. He says explicitly in his letter, no nation in the history of the Jewish people have oppressed us more than the Arabs. This is what Maimonides writes. Now, he's wrong about that in an objective sense, right? If he tried to get that peer reviewed in an academic Jewish history journal, I hope the person would reject it and say, this is not true. But he wasn't writing, this is great. They all love us here, right? So I think we have to push back against that. And again, there are some very, this is why, by the way, just one more thing. I know that this is a long answer to a short question. This is why Israelis don't even understand the problem that we're in, right? Like, we at least intuitively understand, okay, everybody sees us as white. How do we, explain that we're not? When you try to explain this to an Israeli, who's lived in Israel their whole life, oh, they see us as, a bunch of Ashkenazi, they are like so dumbfounded. They're like, do they not realize that most Israelis are not from Poland, that most Israelis are from Morocco? I mean, you can't even explain it to them without them cracking up. And so I think we need to do a better job at that. Professor Scott, go for it.
Well, first of all, this is so sobering, and I love the historical lens of the 20s to think about today. And I was thinking about a lot of parallels about the anti-immigration fervor, just generally in the United States as well, right now, which is a big part of our politics. But I was thinking one experience that I'm having on college campus, and that I sense from my children as well, who are also college students, or one who just graduated and one who graduated a while back, is that there's a lot of anti-Semitism that doesn't get in the news. And I'm not sure if it's correct to call it anti-Semitism, but it sort of fits into the way, like, I know a lot more about race in American politics, but so if you were around in the 40s and you would say, oh, Black people love watermelon, or some horrible stereotype like that seems harmless, but you would say out of ignorance. There's so much more of that seems to be coming out of the woodwork on college campuses. That's one point I wanted to raise. And the other one is the role of faculty, non-Jewish faculty in particular, but some Jewish faculty, teaching about the Middle East, about, American, racial politics, and students really following this idea of settler colonialism and really thinking, oh, this is an intellectual idea with real weight. Listen to my professors talking about it. There's art, and they're not hearing the arguments against it very clearly. It's not being out there. And I know that you're trying very hard to sort of present it. I know I am too. But when I do that, students are really just like, this is new information, brand new information. And I just wanted to put those on the table and just get your feedback and your reactions to those two things.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I know you obviously have a lot of firsthand experience with that. It's a problem in two ways. I mean, one, it's a societal problem for universities because no one's trusting experts anymore. I mean, in very scary ways. I mean, let's pick the most obvious example, right? COVID, right? There are people who spend their entire lives studying epidemiology. I know nothing about what a cell is. And yet, there are a lot of people who are in my knowledge category that think they don't need to trust the PhDs because, oh, they're all biased anyway. And this is trickling down to a lot of things. I mean, this is basically torn us in half between Republicans and Democrats, but even among Democrats, this is starting to tear people in half because there is this sense of, it seems like a lot of academics, not all, of course, but a lot of academics are just more interested in activism than they are of, academia and a liberal education. And so, yeah, I think it's responsible for the breakdown in trust of universities. There's a lot of data that's showing that, young men, right? I'll harp on men for a second. Young men are moving to the right in very fast numbers. I think it's connected to that also because, as somebody who is without reading too much into this, right? The idea of masculinity is in some way under attack. And so we're not doing a good job at teaching our young boys, our young men in college, okay, there's a way to be a strong masculine in a healthy way and a way to be a strong masculine in a detrimental way. It's not that strong masculinity is always bad, right? Like, we can like sports, we can like to barbecue, we can like to sit around and, make jokes, right? That's different than treating people badly, right? That's different than, right? Like, these are very, I think, obvious things, but in a lot of situations, if you are a strong masculine type, right? I obviously am a strong masculine type. I fit, most stereotypes that somebody would have if they opened a psychology book from the 1950s, right? I'm messier. I like sports, right? I'm loud, right? Like all of it, right? We have to tell our young men that that's not wrong, right? Just use that for positive things. So if you're loud, use your voice to protect people who don't have a voice. Don't shut up, right? Like, and so I think it's a problem because academics now are using their pulpit for activism, and they're speaking to just a more narrowing group of people that are becoming even more radicalized in this, echo chamber of confirmation bias. The rest of society is sort of, I mean, again, it stinks to say this, but if a anthropology department at, some random university comes out with a statement, that does nothing to change my view on the situation, even if I've never heard of the situation before, right? Like, and that's bad, right? I should be able to trust academics, right? I don't have time to do work of looking at every situation that's ever emerged in history, but the reality is, because of these lenses, and so we have to get back to like real capital L liberal education of, here are a couple of views. Here are reasons why people of different views agree with each of these views. What do you as the student think? And we take this intuitively, right? The example that I've been giving my medieval Jewish thought class, because I always present, here's Kabbalah's view, here's the Rambam's view, here's Judah Halevi's view, and I never tell them what I think. The goal of a math teacher is not to have you memorize that 10 times 8 is 80, right? The goal is not to memorize 80. It's to understand how 10 times 8 gives you any number, right? And so the goal of education should not be you memorizing Maimonides had an approach that believed that God was unknowable and therefore don't describe him, right? I don't care if students, I mean, I do care, but like, that's not the goal. It's how did Maimonides get to the point where he believed that God was unknowable, and why did other, Jewish thinkers in Spain in the 12th and 1300s, why did they disagree, right? Like, that's a lot more interesting, but sadly, I don't think that's the way academia is moving. So thank you so much for the thought. I know it's 10:30. I think we probably finish up. I'll take one more question if anyone has. But Scott, it's your call. I don't want to.
We can continue if there are other questions. We have a few more minutes to go over, if you don't mind, Rabbi.
Yeah, I have to be on campus at 11, but it's only a 10-minute drive, so I'm here for.
I see Susan Glass waving her hand.
Yes, Susan.
Other people had.
I'm wondering about what will happen with the demonstrations on campus now that this semester has ended or is about to end. Thinking also, and this may not be correct, that there are outside agitators organizing things. And I know this is a crystal ball kind of question, but what's your sense and what's Scott's sense?
My sense is that over the summer, we're going to be seeing some of the biggest changes in campus in the last 50 years from campus administration. On the administration side, every campus administration in the country right now is in crisis mode, and they are trying to, run out the clock till the year ends, and they're going to spend the entire summer figuring out what the heck just happened and how they're going to stop it in the fall, because the agitators will be back in the fall. They are going to be spending their summer trying to figure out how to keep this a front page issue. And, so I don't know how that's going to play out. It's going to be fascinating. I mean, separate than the personal aspect, I'm very interested to see what happens from a sociological perspective. I also think the Jewish community, I mean, we're going to be seeing a lot more centralized activity. And so I think it's going to be a big summer for administration, a big summer for faculty, a big summer for anti-Israel students, a big summer for pro-Israel students. I think once everybody goes into summer break and has, a month to sort of like take a breath and reflect on what happened, I have no idea what's going to happen after that. So thank you for the question. I don't know, Scott, if you have anything to add in terms of thoughts.
I have to say that I want to be optimistic, but I'm really worried. And here's why. Two big things. It's going to be the presidential election. And unfortunately for us, Jews have become a wedge issue. Zionism has become a wedge issue. Israel has become a wedge issue. It's being exploited to divide erstwhile Jewish supporters of the Democrats by the right. It's been used by on the left to attack the current president. So we're in this is going to be centrally important to the nation as a whole, and of course, young people are not immune to that, and they're going to be participating in that, and that's going to be driving this. Second thing, I do think universities are desperately trying to figure out how will they react, but we've got all sorts of different models. Some are going to be coming like cracking down hard against any protest, kick, Students for Justice of Palestine chapters off campus, which is only going to, right. And then you have others that are going to say, well, we're going to have this much more broader free speech code. It's going to be much more clear. And so, but as I saw, somebody was writing in the chat, uh, we can expect more protests in the fall. And we're going to have a lot more on our plate, I think, as in that context. And I'm doing what I know you are too, Rabbi. We're doing what we can to try to prepare our campuses, not just ourselves. I know Tammy and Hillel are working hard. Hillel International is working really hard to do that. Universities have great people, but they also have a lot of people who are just ignorant and not focused on the needs of Jews. And so it's going to be I think it's going to be a difficult semester the fall, unfortunately.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm so sorry I have to run because I have to bring some stuff to campus. We have an event at 11.
Well, thank you so much, Dana. I'm sorry to have gotten on the soapbox there at the end.
Thank you.
No, it's great. Thank you. Thank you again, everybody. And stay in touch. If anybody wants to be connected to Hillel here in Orange County, feel free to, I'll drop my email into the chat, and I would love to connect you with, anyone and everyone.
I'll encourage all of you to contribute financially to Hillel here in Orange County and wherever you are, because Hillel students need that support.
Right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you both, Scott and Rabbi. It was a great class and so important and timely. Thank you both. Thank you both. Come back. Talk to us again.
Next week is still to be announced, but there will be an ALI and you'll hear about it really soon. Okay?
Great.